The blizzard howled through the cursed forest, wind whipping against the ancient ruins like the wailing of the damned. Snow churned in restless swirls, blanketing the world in ghostly silence, and in the midst of that frozen wasteland, a beast lay dying. Soren staggered through the storm, his massive frame shuddering beneath layers of ice and blood. His fur-lined cloak hung in tattered shreds, the deep claw marks on his chest still weeping crimson. The battle had been brutal, half his pack slaughtered, his enemies relentless. Now, alone and hunted, he could feel the cold creeping into his bones, death slithering closer with each ragged breath. But then he saw her. A figure stood at the entrance of an abandoned castle, bathed in silver moonlight. Unmoving, watching. A woman. No, not a woman. Something else. Even from a distance, Soren felt it, the unnatural pull. Her beauty was a cold and merciless thing, sharper than any blade. Midnight hair cascaded over her shoulders, as dark as the void between stars. Her skin, pale as untouched snow, shimmered in the darkness. And her eyes, God's, those eyes, a shade of burning violet, glowing like twin flames in the night. A vampire. Soren's instincts roared, muscles tightening, breath hitching with the urge to fight or flee. Every legend, every whispered warning, told him what she was, a predator, a creature of hunger and death. But his body betrayed him. She was exquisite, a siren carved from moonlight and shadows, a curse, and yet irresistible. The woman tilted her head, studying him with quiet amusement. There was no fear in her, no hesitation, only that knowing gaze, like she could already taste his desperation. "You're freezing," she said, voice like silk against steel, "and bleeding all over my doorstep." Soren's jaw clenched. He had fought kings, had torn through battlefields soaked in carnage, had never bowed to any being, man or monster. And yet something in her tone unraveled him. "I don't need your help," he growled, but even he heard the weakness in his voice. A cruel smile touched her lips. "No. Then why do your legs tremble?" A growl rumbled from his chest, low and dangerous. The urge to lunge at her, to claim dominance over the deadly thing before him, was almost unbearable. But his strength was waning, and she knew it. The vampire stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a whisper of movement. Too fast, too smooth, too inhuman. The air between them crackled, the scent of winter and blood thick between them. Soren should have stepped back, should have bared his teeth, but her fingers, cold, feather-light, brushed against his jaw, tilting his face toward hers. The moment their skin touched, a shiver unlike any he had known tore through him. Not from the cold, from her. "You'll die out here," she murmured. And that would be such a waste. Soren's breath was unsteady. His body betrayed him, muscles no longer listening to his will. He felt her power, ancient and wicked, curling around him like an unseen chain. Not magic. Something worse. Desire. It was madness. It was wrong. And yet he wanted to taste the danger on her lips. She leaned in, her breath a whisper against his ear. "Shut up and get in my bed." His restraint shattered. A snarl tore from his throat, his hands locking onto her waist, yanking her against him. She did not flinch. She did not resist. She only smiled, like she had already won. And as the storm raged around them, Soren knew nothing would ever be the same again. The fire burned low in the stone hearth, throwing flickering shadows across the cavernous chamber. The ruined castle was as cold as the grave, its towering walls a prison of frost and silence. And yet, despite the icy air, the heat between them was suffocating. Soren sat on the edge of a massive, fur-lined bed, his muscles tight, his instincts screaming. His wounds had begun to heal, but his pride still bled. A werewolf, saved by a vampire. The very idea of it clawed at his mind. Celine stood by the window, bathed in moonlight. The silver glow kissed her skin, making her look less like a woman and more like a vision, a phantom carved from night itself. Too still, too perfect, too dangerous. She had not spoken since dragging his half-dead body inside, but her presence alone was enough to coil tension in his gut. She turned, her violet eyes locking onto him with quiet amusement. "You look uncomfortable." Soren scoffed, rolling his shoulders. His body still ached, but he would rather tear his own throat out than admit weakness in front of her. "I don't make a habit of sleeping in vampire dens." Celine smirked, gliding toward him, her every step silent as death. "And yet here you are." He didn't move as she stopped before him, close enough that the scent of her, dark roses, and something untamed, wrapped around him like a noose. His hands twitched with the urge to grab her, to remind her which of them was the true predator, but she wasn't afraid of him. That made her dangerous. That made her intoxicating. "You're burning up," she murmured, tilting her head. "Werewolves heal fast, but your body is still weak." Soren let out a rough breath. "I don't need your concern, bloodsucker." Her lips curled. "Concern? No, but you are in my bed, wolf." She reached out, trailing a single ice-cold finger down his chest, barely skimming over the ridges of his scars. "I'm simply deciding whether I should let you stay." Heat flared through him, raw, uncontrollable, dangerous. His grip clenched on the fur beneath him, his breath turning sharp. Her touch was the cold kiss of death itself, and yet it burned him more than fire ever could. "You enjoy playing with fate, don't you?" His voice was low, a warning wrapped in gravel. Celine leaned in, her lips just inches from his ear. "Fate is a coward. I prefer monsters." Something snapped. With a growl, Soren moved, fast, brutal, unstoppable. His hands caught her waist, lifting her effortlessly, pinning her against the stone pillar beside the bed. Her breath hitched, but her expression did not change. No fear, no protest, only wicked, knowing amusement. "You think you can tame me?" He snarled, his voice thick with something primal. Celine's fingers slid through his dark hair, her nails grazing his scalp, sending sharp pulses of pleasure down his spine. "No," she whispered, her voice dripping like poisoned honey. "But I do wonder if you'd like to be." Soren's breath came rough, uneven. Every inch of him was wired, aching, starved. For a fight. For control. For her. But he knew the danger. This wasn't some simple hunger. She was a venom sinking into his soul, and he was letting her. For a long, pulsing moment, they stood locked together. A beast and a ghost, destruction and desire bound by an invisible chain. Then, as if deciding she had played enough, Celine slid from his grasp, too quick, too effortless. She smoothed down the fabric of her gown, her violet eyes gleaming. "Get some rest, wolf," she purred. "I need you strong. Tomorrow, we hunt." And just like that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving Soren alone with the firelight, his pulse pounding like war drums in his ears. He had faced death 1,000 times. But this woman, this vampire, she might be the first thing to truly destroy him. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moonlit frost. Beyond the ruins, the cursed forest stretched endlessly, whispering with unseen creatures lurking in the shadows. The world felt on edge, like a storm coiled, waiting to strike. Soren moved like a phantom through the towering trees, his body thrumming with raw energy. The ache of his wounds had faded, but something far more dangerous had taken its place, an unfamiliar, maddening need, and it had everything to do with the woman walking ahead of him. Celine. She glided through the darkness, unhurried, effortless, her pale form untouched by the cold. The long flowing fabric of her gown swayed with each step, as if the night itself bent to her will. She did not look back, yet he could feel her awareness of him, just as sharp as the awareness burning inside him. She was unnatural, unholy, a vampire. And yet, the longer he was near her, the more he wanted to tear apart the world just to keep her close. At last, she stopped in a clearing, where ancient stones jutted from the ground, their surfaces carved with forgotten symbols. Moonlight bathed them in silver, the air humming with an old, nameless power. "This place," Soren muttered, eyeing the ruins, "feels cursed." Celine turned, her violet gaze catching the light like a predator's in the dark. "It is." A small, knowing smile curved her lips, "which is why it suits us." Soren exhaled slowly, fighting the pull, the unrelenting force that had been drawing him toward her since the night she dragged him from the snow. He should hate her. He should want to rip her apart. But instead, the thought of her slipping away made something inside him turn savage. "Why did you bring me here?" he demanded. Celine took a step closer, her movements fluid, silent as death. "Because," she said, voice like silk over steel, "you are still bound by your past, and I am bound by mine." Her gaze darkened. "But I am done being a prisoner. The only chains I wear now are the ones I choose." A flick of her wrist, and a small dagger appeared in her grasp. The blade was black as night, ancient, humming with magic. Without hesitation, she dragged the tip across her palm. Dark, forbidden blood welled up, rich and intoxicating. Soren stiffened, the scent hitting him like a drug. His fingers curled into fists, nails nearly piercing his skin. Everything inside him screamed that this was wrong. Werewolves and vampires did not mix. They did not share blood, did not swear loyalty, did not drink. Celine whispered, stepping closer, her bleeding hand outstretched. The world tilted. The primal part of him, the beast, the instinct, the hunger, rose, clawing at his restraint. His breath came harsh, the wild drum of his heartbeat shaking his ribs. "Do you even understand what you're asking for?" he growled. Celine smiled, slow and lethal. "Yes, do you?" She was offering him more than just blood. She was offering a bond, a binding, a curse of their own making. The logical part of him, the part that still clung to the laws of their worlds, told him to turn away. But the truth was, he had already given in. He had lost this fight the moment she had touched him. With a slow, deliberate movement, Soren grasped her wrist, his fingers wrapping around her delicate bones. He lifted her hand to his mouth, holding her gaze, daring her to regret this. Then he licked a single drop of blood from her palm. Fire. It shot through him like lightning, setting every nerve ablaze. His vision sharpened, his senses roared, his muscles tensed with the raw force of something ancient and unbreakable. The world around them seemed to shudder, as if the very land recognized what had just been done. Celine's breath hitched, and for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, desire, or something far more dangerous. Soren didn't care. He reached for the dagger, slicing his own palm open. His blood, hot, wild, untamed, mingled with hers. He pressed their hands together, sealing the bond, feeling it latch onto his very soul. Celine exhaled, a slow, satisfied sound. "Now, Wolf," she murmured, voice dripping with wicked amusement, "we belong to each other." Soren pulled her against him, his grip firm, possessive. "Careful what you wish for, vampire." His lips brushed the shell of her ear, his voice nothing but a dark promise. "Because I don't let go." The wind howled, the ruins trembled, and the night itself seemed to shift, as if recognizing that something had changed. Something irreversible, something that could never be undone. And neither of them would ever be the same again. The air between them crackled like a storm waiting to break. The taste of blood still lingered on Soren's tongue, intoxicating and unnatural. His body burned from the inside out, every nerve alight with something primal, forbidden, unstoppable. Celine stood before him, her violet eyes glowing in the darkness. There was no fear in her, no hesitation, only a quiet, knowing satisfaction. The blood bond had taken root, twisting into something deeper, something neither of them could undo. You feel it, don't you? She murmured, tilting her head. Soren's jaw tightened. Of course, he felt it. His body, his very instincts, had changed. The moment her blood had touched his tongue, something inside him had awakened, something old and wild. It wasn't just hunger. It wasn't just desire. It was possession. Celine smirked, stepping closer, her movements slow, deliberate. She moved like a shadow, like the night itself, untouched by the laws of mortal creatures. Her scent, dark roses, frost, and something richer now, something uniquely hers, wrapped around him, making it impossible to think of anything else. You're restless, she observed, voice like silk over steel. Fighting it. Soren's hands curled into fists at his sides. She was playing with him. She knew exactly what she had done, what fire she had lit inside him. His control was slipping. With a low, warning growl, he closed the space between them in a single stride. Fast, unstoppable, dominant. His fingers gripped her jaw, tilting her face up to his, forcing her to hold his gaze. "Tell me," he demanded, voice rough. "Was this your plan all along? To bind me to you?" Celine's lips parted slightly, but she did not pull away. She didn't need to. She was stronger than she looked, strong enough to ruin him if she chose. Her hands lifted, trailing up his chest, slow, featherlight. "Would it matter?" she whispered. Soren's breath came heavy, his body thrumming with raw, unfiltered energy. She was testing him, pushing him to the edge, waiting to see how far he would fall. His grip tightened, just enough to remind her who she was dealing with. "You think I'm yours now, vampire." His voice was low, a dangerous promise. "You have no idea what you've done." Celine's smirk deepened, her fingers ghosting over the scars on his chest. "Oh, I think I do," she murmured. Her gaze flickered, violet flames burning in the night. "The question is, do you?" A growl rumbled deep in his chest. His body screamed to take, to claim, to remind her that a werewolf was never tamed. But Celine was no ordinary prey. She was his equal, his enemy, his undoing, and he had never wanted anything more. In one swift motion, he spun her, pinning her back against the ancient stone pillar. A whisper of a gasp left her lips, soft, almost surprised. But her eyes, they gleamed with delight. The tension between them snapped like lightning in a summer storm. Soren leaned in, his lips grazing the shell of her ear, his breath hot against her cool skin. "You should have run when you had the chance," he murmured. Celine tilted her head slightly, just enough to brush her lips near his jaw. "And miss this." The word sent fire through his veins. His control, that fragile, fraying thread, was gone. His hand slid down, gripping her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the stark contrast between her cold, ethereal form and his burning heat. The difference between them should have repelled them apart, but instead, it bound them tighter. She was death. He was fury. And together, they were something neither of them understood. Celine let out a soft hum, her fingers curling into his hair. "Careful, wolf," she whispered, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as a dagger. "You're starting to sound like you don't want to let me go." Soren exhaled harshly. "I don't." The admission hung in the air between them, undeniable, irreversible. For a long moment, they stayed like that, caught between war and surrender, between destruction and something far more dangerous. Then, with a wicked smile, Celine pulled away, slipping from his grasp like a shadow. "Good," she purred, "because I have no intention of letting you go either." And as she disappeared into the night, Soren realized with a dark certainty, he was already hers, and he would never escape. The night whispered with secrets, the wind carrying the scent of blood and frost. Somewhere in the distance, the howl of a lone wolf shattered the silence, a raw, aching sound. Soren barely heard it. His focus was entirely on her. Celine stood at the edge of the ruined temple, framed by the shattered stone, and the endless night. The silver glow of the moon bathed her in an eerie, unearthly beauty. She was too still, too perfect, like something carved from the darkness itself. A vampire, a predator, a creature he should hate. And yet, Soren had never hungered for anything more. The bond between them burned through his veins, an invisible chain that tightened with every breath. He could still taste her blood on his tongue, rich and forbidden, the power of it humming beneath his skin. Celine turned, her violet eyes locking onto him, piercing through the shadows. "You're different now," she murmured. Soren stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, a hunter approaching his prey. "Whose fault is that?" A small, knowing smile curved her lips. "You drank from me willingly, wolf." His jaw clenched. "You offered." Celine laughed softly, a sound as dangerous as it was enchanting. "And you think I did that out of kindness?" Soren was in front of her now, close enough to see the rise and fall of her breath, to feel the unnatural cold radiating from her skin. His instincts screamed at him to strike, to reclaim his dominance. Instead, he reached out. His fingers traced the sharp line of her jaw, the delicate column of her throat. Celine did not move away. She did not flinch. "You should be afraid of me," Soren murmured, his voice low, rough with something he couldn't name. Her lips parted slightly, a flicker of something dark and undeniably tempting crossing her expression. "Afraid," she whispered. "No, Wolf. I am intrigued." Something inside him snapped. His hands moved before he could think, gripping her waist, pulling her against him. Her body was cold against his heat, a contrast that only made the fire in his blood burn hotter. Celine let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the scars on his bare chest. Deliberate, slow, testing. "You feel it too," he said, his voice dark. Celine's nails pressed slightly into his skin. "It is not a matter of feeling," she whispered, "but of knowing." His grip tightened. "And what do you know? Vampire." Celine leaned in, her lips brushing dangerously close to his. "Not a kiss. Not yet. Just a ghost of contact. That we are bound," she murmured. "That no force in this world will break what we've done." Soren growled low in his throat, a sound of possession, of raw hunger, of something deeper than desire. "You should have thought of that before you tempted a wolf." Celine smirked. "Perhaps I wanted to be hunted." The words sent a pulse of heat through him, his body tensing, his control slipping further. She was playing with fire, with something neither of them could stop now. And she knew it. For the first time in his life, Soren realized this was no ordinary hunger, no simple desire. This was a war of souls, a battle neither of them could win. And God's help him, he didn't want to. Celine pulled away first, slipping from his grasp like mist. Her eyes gleamed, full of silent promises and dark amusement. "We should leave before dawn," she said, voice smooth, effortless, as if she hadn't just unraveled him. "The hunt awaits." Soren exhaled sharply, watching her disappear into the shadows. The hunt. No, she was the hunt, and he would never stop chasing her. The forest was alive with whispers, the trees swaying under the weight of secrets. Moonlight spilled through the skeletal branches, painting silver streaks across the frozen earth. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cried, a warning, or perhaps a curse. Soren didn't care. His focus was locked on the figure ahead of him, moving effortlessly through the darkness. Celine. She was a phantom, her long gown flowing like liquid shadow, her every step unnaturally silent. She was leading him deeper into the unknown, deeper into the wild. And he was following, always following. Soren could feel the bond coiled tight around his soul, a leash made of fire and blood. He had tried to fight it. He had tried to silence the raw, aching pull that demanded he claim what was his. But the truth was, he had never wanted to resist. Celine stopped without warning. The sudden stillness sent a shiver down his spine. She stood in the middle of a ruined archway, her pale skin glowing under the cold light of the moon. She looked untouched by time, as if she had stepped from a forgotten legend. Slowly, she turned. "You're tense," she murmured, watching him with violet eyes that saw too much. "You feel it growing stronger, don't you?" Soren exhaled, his fists clenching. "You did this to me." Celine tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "And yet you followed me here." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She was playing with him again, testing his control, pushing him toward the breaking point. Soren took a step forward, then another. His body moved with deadly purpose, his blood roaring with heat, with power. Celine did not move away. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Her skin was cold, so delicate, so deceiving. He could break her if he wanted to. But the truth? She was the one undoing him. "You should be afraid," he growled, his voice rough with something he could no longer contain. Celine's lips parted, her breath ghosting against his skin. "And yet I am not." Soren's grip tightened, his fingers pressing into the fragile bones of her wrist. His body was a coil of tension, his instincts torn between devouring her and protecting her. His thumb brushed over her pulse, but there was none. A silent reminder of what she was, what they could never be. And yet, his other hand lifted, fingers tangling into the silk of her midnight dark hair. "You haunt me," he murmured. Celine's gaze flickered, something unreadable flashing through her violet depths. "Then stop chasing me." Soren let out a rough, humorless laugh. "We both know that's not possible." She smiled then, slow, dangerous, wicked. "Good," she whispered. Soren didn't think. He acted. In one swift motion, he pulled her against him, his heat clashing against her ice. She gasped, her hands coming up to press against his chest, but she did not push him away. She had never truly wanted to. His breath was hot against her cheek, his grip firm, unyielding. "This bond," he rasped, "it's madness." Celine's fingers curled against him, sharp nails dragging lightly over his skin. "Then let it consume us." The words were a challenge, a temptation, a promise. Soren let out a low primal growl. He had spent his entire life fighting, resisting, keeping the beast inside him caged. But she had broken the lock. And now, there was no turning back. Celine's lips curled in triumph, her fangs glinting under the moonlight. They were fire and shadow, predator and predator. And whatever they were becoming, it would destroy them both. The wind howled through the abandoned ruins, carrying the scent of winter and blood. The night pulsed with an unnatural energy, thick with something neither of them could name. Soren stood at the brink of something irreversible. Celine faced him, her violet eyes glowing in the moonlight. She was still, poised like a queen surveying her kingdom, a kingdom of darkness and temptation. And he was standing in the center of it, caught in her gravity, unable to turn away. The bond between them was suffocating now, threading through his veins, tightening around his very soul. He could still taste her, still feel the way her body had molded against his, cold and soft, yet stronger than steel. She was looking at him now, waiting, testing. Soren exhaled sharply. She wanted him to break first. Not yet. His steps were slow, measured. His boots crunched against the frozen earth as he closed the space between them. The moment stretched, humming with tension, with something vast and ancient, raw and unshakable. Celine's lips curled into something unreadable. "You're still fighting it," she murmured, almost amused. Soren stopped inches from her. "Too close. Not close enough. You think I'll surrender to you." Celine lifted a delicate hand, brushing her fingers along the scar on his jaw. The contact was light, feather-soft, yet it burned. "I think you already have," she whispered. Soren's control snapped like a thread pulled too tight. With a growl, he caught her wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. He felt the steady chill of her skin beneath his fingers, a contrast to the fire raging inside him. Celine let him hold her there, watching him through half-lidded eyes, her expression unreadable, daring him. His other hand tangled into her hair, tilting her head back. "You think you're in control." His voice was rough, edged with something dark. Celine's smirk deepened. "And you think you are?" The words were a challenge, a spark tossed into the inferno between them. Soren didn't move, didn't breathe. This war had never been about dominance. It had never been about control. It had been inevitable. His grip tightened slightly, just enough to remind her of his strength. A warning, a promise. Celine didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her free hand and trailed her nails lightly down his chest, tracing the ridges of old wounds, scars of battles fought long before her. "You're burning," she murmured, her voice like silk laced with steel. "I can feel it." Soren clenched his jaw. She had no right to read him so easily, to peel him apart with a single touch, a single look. But she had. And God's help him, he didn't want her to stop. "You're playing a dangerous game, vampire," he growled. Celine arched a delicate brow. "And you aren't." His breath was sharp, his body thrumming with something he could no longer deny. There was no fight left to give, no resistance worth holding on to. His grip loosened, just slightly, his fingers tracing the edge of her pulse point, a pulse that didn't exist. Celine leaned in, her lips a breath away from his, her voice a whisper against his skin. "Say it." Soren closed his eyes for the briefest moment, a long, slow exhale escaping his lips. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation left. "I'm yours." The words sealed something between them, something eternal, something ruinous. Celine's lips curved, her fangs glinting under the moonlight. "Good," she whispered. Then she was gone, slipping from his grasp, her laughter like a haunting melody in the night. Soren stood alone, breathless, his body still burning from her touch. She had won. But deep in his chest, where his heart still beat like a war drum, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The night was endless. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying the scent of frost and the distant whisper of something ancient, something watching. Soren stood at the edge of the ruin, his body tense, his blood still burning. Celine had vanished into the darkness, but her presence clung to him like a curse. She had won. She had taken him apart with nothing but a touch, a look, a whispered challenge. And yet, she had fled. Soren's hands clenched into fists, his claws threatening to break through his skin. He had sworn himself to no one, had vowed never to let anything, anyone, hold him in chains. But now he was bound. Not by force, by choice. The realization was a blade to his pride, sharp and unforgiving. But beneath the storm of his thoughts, something else burned. Something deeper, something darker. She had run, but she couldn't hide from him. Not anymore. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his instincts guiding him into the shadows. The hunt had begun. Celine was waiting for him. She stood at the heart of the ruins, bathed in moonlight, her midnight dark gown swirling around her like mist. Unshaken, unafraid. She had known he would come. Soren stepped forward, his boots silent against the frozen stone. His golden eyes burned, locked onto her with an intensity that sent a shiver through the air. Celine tilted her head, her violet eyes unreadable. "You're angry." Soren exhaled sharply. "I don't like being played with." A small, knowing smile curved her lips. "Is that what you think this is?" His body moved before he could stop himself. One moment, there was distance between them. The next, he had her against the cold stone, his hands caving her in. Celine didn't flinch, didn't fight. She only watched him, waiting. Soren's breath was ragged, his muscles tense with the war inside him. She had done this to him. She had shattered his control. And still, he couldn't walk away. His fingers brushed against her throat, feeling the unnatural stillness beneath her skin. "What have you done to me?" he rasped. Celine's lashes lowered, her voice nothing but a whisper. What have we done to each other? The words sent a bolt of heat through him, a wildfire he couldn't contain. There was no denying it now. No running, no resisting. They were bound, by blood, by hunger, by a fate neither of them could escape. Celine reached up, her fingers costing over his jaw, tracing the tension there. You still think this is about control, she murmured. Soren swallowed hard, his grip tightening. Then tell me what it's about. Her smile was slow, dangerous. Surrender. His heart pounded, a wild, untamed rhythm. She was right. It had never been about who would break first. They had already fallen, long before either of them had spoken it aloud. Soren leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath mingling with the icy air between them. If I surrender, he murmured, his voice rough, you're coming with me. Celine's fingers curled against his skin. Then take me. A growl rumbled in his chest, deep and possessive. He would never let her go now. The night closed around them, the darkness swallowing their fate whole, and together they disappeared into it.